Today we're talking about Race for the Galaxy, where I don't want to spend a lot of time on the game itself. I want to talk about what went into the design and hopefully help you design your own games. Just to help me calibrate things a little bit, how many of you have played Race for the Galaxy? Ooh, very nice. Now, how many of you haven't? Don't feel free to get the hands up. Helps me calibrate. You won't hurt my feelings. All right. We'll have a brief intro, then I'll do an overview of Race to give you enough structure to hang the design on, and then I'll get into the design stuff. The takeaway that I hope you have is some ideas to help make your own games more strategic. All right. My name is Tom Lehmann. I'm the designer of Race for the Galaxy. My first game was published in 1992. I've been a full-time freelance designer since 2008. I've done various board, dice, card, and with Matt Leacock, he brought me on board to do the pandemic expansions with him, and so I've done some co-ops as well. The game we're talking about today, Race for the Galaxy, is a card game, a tabletop card game. It was published in 2007 by Rio Grande Games. It's for 2 to 4 players and typically takes 20 to 40 minutes. It's had 5 expansions so far, with another one that's been announced, greenlit for next year. It's also had 3 spin-off games. Roll for the Galaxy, which is a dice version of Race, and that itself has had 2 more expansions. Rivalry will be out in June. It's had Jump Drive, an even simpler introductory card game, and then New Frontiers, which is a board game, which will be out late summer. It's you can play it online in a browser at Board Game Arena. They have over 5 million games of it played on that site. There is a free open source PC version that if you have any interest in AI and neural networks, I recommend that you take a look at the source. That began as an AI project by Keldon Jones. Built on top of that is a mobile app by Temple Gates Games, which supports both AI and internet play. There's a Steam version as well, and they added a really nice UI on top of it. So, about the game. It's a card game, and the cards are 2 different types. There are action cards that you use to select the phases, and there are game cards, which are the cards you actually play to build your space empire. You start with 4 cards in hand out of a choice of 6, and you have 1 start world on the table as the start of your empire. During the game, players select their actions secretly and simultaneously. There are 5 possible phases, but only the selected phases will occur in each round. When a phase occurs, everyone can do it. So if I call develop, everyone can place a development. And the player who selects a phase gets a bonus in it. So for example, in a 3-player game, if players A and C both chose develop, it'll only happen once. Everyone can place a development, but A and C will get the bonus. Then everyone will have a chance to settle, and B will get the bonus. One of the consequences of this is that every round tends to be different. So we might have a game that starts out in the first round with develop and settle. Then in the second round, explore and consume. And then in the third round, explore, settle, and produce when the 3 players all choose different actions. You explore to find new cards. You develop and settle to build your empire. So develop is how the game cards are divided into developments and worlds, and development is how we place the ones with a diamond. Worlds with the circle are placed during the settle phase. The gray worlds are essentially like developments in that they provide powers, but the colored worlds, and there are 4 colors of worlds, are worlds that can have a good on them. A good is just a face down card taken from the draw pile and placed on top of the world. And in the computer implementations, you can see that they can color code those according to the type of the world it's on, which determines what type of good it is. Produce is what creates the goods on the production world, and consume is how you convert goods into VP chips and card draws. So here we have two consume powers. This one will take any type of good and turn it into one victory point chip. This one will take any type of good and turn it into a victory point chip and a card draw. Obviously, the second power is better, but you can only use one of these powers on one goods. So if you had two goods, you'd get 2 victory points and 1 card draw. So that gives us 2 phases in which you're building out your empire, 2 phases in which you're producing and consuming goods. And this leads to 2 different ways that the game can end. It can end when any player gets 12 or more cards in their empire, or when the communal victory point pool is emptied. In that case, we add these 10-point chips to the pool so that everyone gets all the chips that they're entitled to. In both cases, we finish out the round and then we score it up. There are 3 ways to score victory points. There's the victory point chips that you earn during consume. There's the victory point value of the cards in your empire. Cards in your hand do not score. And finally, there are the VP bonuses from the SITS cost developments. Here we have a SITS cost development, Alien Tech Institute, and it pays off for all the yellow worlds in your empire, plus any cards with the alien tag, such as Alien Tech Institute itself. And then whoever has the most victory points is the winner. So that's Race for the Galaxy in a nutshell. Hopefully that'll be enough to let you hang the design discussion on it. It's a game with simultaneous action selection. You're finding cards that fit together to form strategies. You're doing empire building, you're building VP engines, and you're trying to score those 6 cost bonuses. So now we're going to dive into the actual design. The first thing to notice is that unlike many Euro games, this game does not have a set number of turns. That instantly produces strategy along the lines of how fast do you do something? Do you do a quick tableau rush where you're putting out lots of cheap worlds and developments to try to end the game quickly before someone else gets going? Or do you try for more expensive but denser with more victory point worlds and developments? Do you, on the produce consume side, you could put down just a couple of production worlds that have consumption, not all of them do, and run that for victory points immediately. Or you could put down production worlds and then nice consume powers in order to get more victory points. So simply by not forcing a set number of turns, you instantly get some strategy about the pace. But you get even more strategy out of the fact that you have 2 different end conditions. This creates strategic tension in the game as to whether you invest in a victory point engine, do you invest in order to get the discounts to develop and settle and build an empire, or do you try some sort of hybrid strategy in between the 2? As a thought experiment, what if Hearthstone, a popular digital card game, or Magic the Gathering, a popular tabletop card game, had 2 main victory conditions, ones that happened all the time? So imagine that the normal way you win in those games is you drive your opponent to 0 health. However, imagine that they had a tower that they could build, and if they got it to level 10, then they instantly won the game. Now suddenly you're going to think about, well, I could put minions that attack my opponent, but I could also put out minions that build the tower. Which do I want to do? I can put out defenders for myself, so that they defend my health, or I could try to defend those minions who are building the tower. And in particular, as the tower rose, if its height interacted with the various powers of cards, right? If they start to interact, so if at, say, 5th level, archers fired every turn instead of when they first entered the battlefield. And, at 8th level, ballistas worked and dragons flew off the top of the tower and so on. You could get a lot of interactions in the game. I'm not saying that a game is better if it has 2 different winning conditions, but if you have it, it's the easiest way I know to introduce strategic tension into a game. So how do you pay for cards? In Race, you pay for cards by discarding other cards. So here we have a hand of 6 cards. We want to place this development terraforming robot out of our hand. And we have to pay the cost in the diamond. So we have to discard 3 cards out of our hand to pay for it. There's no mana. The cards themselves are the money. If we'd call develop, then we'd have an extra card left in our hand because it gives the bonus for development is that it gives us a discount of 1. So one way to think about the cards in your hand in Race is that they each represent an opportunity, something that you can put into play or not put into play. And this gets us to what economists call opportunity cost, where the cost of something isn't just the resources spent, but what you could have done instead. So some examples from regular life. In college, in most majors, you have a limited number of electives. When you take an elective, the cost isn't just the tuition and your time and your effort, but it's also the fact that you could have taken some other elective and what you might have gained from that elective instead. If you're at a seminar session, the cost is, well, you could be, instead of listening to me right now, you could be in some other room listening to someone else, and that's part of the cost that you're paying. And similarly, job offers, investments, all these things have opportunity cost. Returning to games, if you have a system that gives you mana, so that you're spending mana to place your cards instead of spending the cards, then you have a much smaller opportunity cost. Say I have 4 mana and I have 2 4-cost cards. Well, I can place one or I can place the other, so there's still an opportunity cost there. But after I place it, on the next turn, I have 4 mana and I can place the other one. So the opportunity cost in those sort of systems is much smaller because you're merely postponing an opportunity as opposed to giving it up when you discard a card. Opportunity cost is often overlooked in games. Richard Garfield talks about the fact that when he first started designing Magic, he didn't think he could have 0-cost cards in the game. He thought it would break the game. And he came to realize that there's an opportunity cost in Magic in that you want your deck to be as small as possible so that it's efficient and the combinations arise. And that this cost is real and meant that he could have 0-cost cards in the game. Because when you draw an Ornithopter, that's a card that you drew instead of some other card. And that some other card might have been more useful for you. So even though the cost is 0, there's still the cost of the slot in your deck. And we know that that cost is at least as much as a 0/2 flying artifact creature. Returning to Race, in a typical game of Race, players draw about 30 to 50 cards per game, but they're only building 8 to 12 of them. This card-sifting mechanism allows for a lot of varieties in strategy. In the Race base game, you have 114 cards, 91 of them are unique. So you can have many different strategies because if you draw a card that doesn't fit your strategy, you just throw it away, using it to pay for some other card. Now, there are other approaches to variety in a game. Deck construction. The problem there is that you need a deck to play. That's an investment of time in advance. Drafting, if it breaks up the play, if you do it over several rounds, like in Seven Wonders, then you have this, I play, then I draft, then I play, then I draft, and that can take people out of the game sometimes. Or alternatively, it must be done before play. In deck building, as a Dominion, you have a large variety of kingdom cards that's possible to be played, but you're using only a subset in each game. Deck sifting integrates variety into the gameplay. And the other benefit of it is that it instantly adds a new class of decisions, hand management. You have a bunch of cards in your hand at the start of the game. You can play them all to put down a big purchase. but then you won't be able to do anything for several rounds until you replenish those cards. Furthermore, if you have cards that you want to save for the end game, they have a cost. They're like a boat anchor in your hand because you can't spend them to pay for something else. There are some criticisms of deck sifting. One is that some players find it too angsty, right? The thought that they discard a card that 2 turns later they realize, oh, I really wanted to keep that card, for them is just a total turnoff. And the other one is that experienced players have a deck knowledge advantage. They know what's in the deck, so they know some of the combos they could wait for, and that informs their discarding decisions. Now, the experienced player issue comes up in all games, whether it's a co-op, whether it's a 2-player competitive game, or a many-player competitive game. So I'm not that much worried about it, but I do note it. So where does all this come from? There's a Euro game called Puerto Rico by Andreas Seyfarth, and it was a very popular game. And Stefan Bruch, the head of Alea, the publisher of Puerto Rico, felt he wanted a card game and he had a very limited time to produce one to capitalize on Puerto Rico's success. And Andreas Seyfarth's prototype wasn't working. So he contacted several designers, including myself, and asked us to essentially become backup Andreas Seyfarths and to design games independently that if Andreas couldn't get his prototype working, that he would then publish instead. So I designed the Puerto Rico card game. I spent 3 months. I went through 3 major iterations. I collapsed Puerto Rico's cost structure from 1 to 10 to 1 to 6. I figured out a bunch of things involving this card sifting. And I presented it to Stefan at the Gathering of Friends. We played it for a week. We made some small tweaks. And at the end of it, he said, Tom, if it was up to him, he'd offer me a contract. But Andreas was involved. So he took it back to Andreas. Andreas looked at it, said, ooh, this solves my problems, but I still want to do my prototype. And so Stefan Bruch combined Andreas Seyfarth's prototype, my cost structure that I developed, and his own ideas about market slips together to form San Juan. I get a royalty from San Juan, but it was a bit disappointing not to see the game that I had designed actually published. Well, San Juan came out. It's a perfectly fine game, but I felt it had not pushed the variety button the way I thought you could push it. In particular, San Juan has 29 unique cards out of a deck of 110. Furthermore, I had an unpublished collectible card game called Duel from the Stars that I felt would be a very good setting. And I had evolved some new action selection ideas over the year and a half intervening. And those are the 3 things that I put together to form Race for the Galaxy after getting permission from Alea and offering them first right of refusal. So the thing that had bothered me about Puerto Rico's action mechanism, it's a classic Euro game. The play goes clockwise, it's not simultaneous. And the interactions between the player are very much this, you constrain the next player as you go around the table. You limit their options, you block them. In particular, when you pick a role, which is their term for an action, you block it for the rest of the round. No one else can pick it. You all get to do it, but you don't get the bonus. This phenomena in which you are affecting the next player downstream the most, J.C. Lawrence has termed left-right binding, and it was beginning to bother me. In particular, I played a number of 5-player games of Puerto Rico in which I had a player upstream of me who would just hammer me and make it so I could never win. Now, if that player had won, I wouldn't be upset, but he never won either. Right? But his attitude was that was how you play the game. You just squeeze the next player as hard as possible. Furthermore, I had played some 5-player games where we had 4 experienced players and 1 novice player. And in those games, the player downstream of the novice player always won. And so I was really getting to the point where I was going, I don't like this left-right binding. And what if the actions were instead picked simultaneously? Doing so gives a greater sense of player agency. If there's an action you really want to do, you just pick it. It eliminates the left-right binding problem, and the game can now go in many more directions because you're no longer forced to pick different roles. You can have all the players pick the same role, as I showed you in an earlier slide. Once I made that decision, then I started going, well, what if the build tempo per round was 0 to 2 instead of 0 to 1? In Puerto Rico, you only have a single build action, so the buildings, which is one of the ways the game can end, only grow at a certain rate. What if we had both develop and settle so that you can potentially go 0 to 2 times? Then I started wondering, well, if I'm going to improve the empire building, what am I going to do about the produce-consume stuff? What if the consume bonus was double the victory points? None of this namby-pamby, just +1 extra VP in the captain role in Puerto Rico. And from those ideas, I began to think about a game where the players had much more control over how the game evolved. The issue with doing simultaneous action selection is that you want all the actions to be equally viable to be called in the early, mid, and late game. It's not very interesting if you have some action that's only going to be called in the late game, because then, there isn't a lot of bluffing or anything. So I started looking at the 5 actions. Explore was easy. You're always looking for cards that fit together. Sometimes, even on the final turn, you're doing a Hail Mary, I will explore and hope to draw the one card that will save my position and pull out the win. Develop was looking pretty good in that you often want to build some technologies early, get some powers down on the board, and you want to build those 6 devs in the late. But what about the mid-game? In both Puerto Rico and San Juan, the buildings that give you bonuses have no powers. They're just for scoring points at the end of the game. I said, what if I put powers on them, so now I had a reason to build them before the end of the game? So here, if I'm committed to doing a yellow strategy where I'm putting down lots of these alien worlds, this -2 discount makes it a lot cheaper. And if I have 3 or 4 yellow worlds, I'll actually pull a profit. So now I have a reason to build this before the end game. And that sort of fits develop. Settle, well, you often want to settle in the early game in order to get your card flow going, in order to put down worlds and get some goods on them and sell them in order to get more cards. They're also, obviously, you want to build them in the mid-game in order to set up your VP engines. But why would anyone want to settle late? From Duel from the Stars, I'd always had this idea that there would be 2 ways to place worlds, that you could both settle them peacefully or you could settle them by military conquest. So I decided to take that from Duel from the Stars. So here's how military works. Here I have a start world that gives me 2 military. I put down this development that gives me 3 more. And that lets me overcome the defense of this card, which in turn gives me another 2 military, which lets me put down the 7 card, which is worth a lot of victory points. Okay? Now, when you do the big military strategy, you often don't want to be calling settle in the middle of the game. You don't want to help the people who are doing these VP engines build their engine. So you'll save your worlds and then slam them down at the end game because you don't have to pay any cards to place the worlds that you do with military. The non-military worlds are essentially placed exactly the same as the developments. You have to discard cards equal to their cost. And the only difference is that the bonus is you draw a card after you place the world instead of getting a discount. So now I had settle working. Produce had the opposite problem. In both San Juan and Puerto Rico, produce looms too large. It has a who bells the cat issue. When you call produce, particularly in Puerto Rico, Then the players after you in the turn order, they get first crack at selling for goods, for shipping them for VPs, and you don't get much for calling produce. So everyone wants someone else to call produce. So I decided to solve that, and I did two things. The first thing is I moved produce to the very end of the round. So if you call produce, then next round, you, like all the other players, can now call an action that benefits from it. The second was I introduced Windfall Worlds. All the worlds I've been showing you up to now were solid circles. This one has a halo, which is a Windfall World. The production worlds only get goods when produce is called. The Windfall Worlds get a good upon being settled. And so now you could settle a Windfall World, sell it this alien good for a large number of cards, and don't call produce. However, this is a sort of a two-sided, a two-edged sword, because the Windfall Worlds don't get goods during produce. They need a power, or the player has to call produce for its bonus, which is to produce a good on one of your Windfall Worlds. So I both gave a way to avoid calling produce and an incentive to call produce. And with those two changes, now produce was being called. It wasn't so dominant the way it is in Puerto Rico, but it was still being called throughout the game. For consumption, its double VP bonus works well in the late game, but why would you ever double your VPs in the early game? We all know for engine building games that you want to build your engine, then score the victory points from them. So consume trade is the bonus that we use to sell goods, and it only sells the goods for that player. Now this may seem very inconsistent with the rest of the game, right? When you call develop, everyone gets to place a develop. When you call settle, everyone gets to place a world. But when you call consume trade, only you get to sell the good for cards. Well, why is this going on? Two reasons. One is the one I've already alluded to, so that the consume is called early on. But the other is to solve the rich gets richer problem. And this is a problem in many games. So in race, if you have an alien production world and it automatically produces on produce, automatically gets a good on produce, and then if you could automatically sell it when anyone called trade, then you would have this huge advantage over other players, and the game would be all about getting the big world down first. So to prevent rich gets richer, I say trade is a bonus. Now this rich gets richer issue is an issue in all of these games, and they all solve it, but in different ways. Puerto Rico has a trading house, and your sales are often blocked. So if someone sells coffee to the trading house in front of you, you can't sell coffee, their high-valued good. If there is coffee left in the trading house from an earlier trade phase, you can't sell it. San Juan uses lower sales prices, those are those market slips I mentioned earlier, and introduces compensation. They have buildings such as the poorhouse, which if you have the poorhouse and not very many cards, you get extra cards. And that's very much a sort of casual Euro approach to this issue. Roll uses lower returns when you factor in the cost of the producer and shipper dice, and Weiwa boosted Explore tremendously as an alternative to the point where some people don't even bother trading goods to run their economy in Roll, they just use Explore. Race gives you the largest return but requires player action. So here we have one issue solved 4 different ways, each way in character with the game itself. Explore also has 2 action cards with different bonuses, allowing you to either get 1 extra card or to go deep into the deck to try to find the card you really want. Simultaneous actions led to some very interesting player interactions. First off, there's bluffing and gambling in the actual calling of the phases. So, for example, if I have an alien good and my hand is full with 10 cards, and I look around the table and I see someone who's likely to develop and another person who's likely to settle, I might just call trade so that I refill my hand after I both place a development and a world. But those other two players might go, Tom has an alien good and a handful of cards. We'll just call explore. He'll sell that good for a bunch of cards and then have to discard them because he's over the hand limit. And so he screwed himself. And so you get a lot of this double think bluffing interactions. You also get gambling interactions. On the final turn, you might have, I have the development in the world that'll let me win the game, but I need both phases called. And then you look around and you go, that person's likely to call settle, so I'll call develop and hope it works. Then within the game, there's also leeching and blunting effects. So develop is the second phase here, and if I see a player who's set up to do lots of develop calls, if I put down this bank, I'll get my cut every time they call develop. Similarly, if someone looks like they're going to call produce to refill an alien windfall, then I can put down this lost species world here. It gives me a genes good, which is almost as good as an alien one, and it gives me 2 extra cards on produce. And this, once I put this on the table, the player who was thinking about calling produce probably isn't going to call it in future turns. So I have blunted their advantage. There's also pressuring interactions in the build tempo. If I'm low on cards and my opponents call both develop and settle, do I put down 2 weak cards, 1 strong card, 1 weak and save? Every misbuild is potentially incurring an opportunity cost, because if the game goes out on tableau and I don't have all my cards on the table, every slot that I didn't fill is lost victory points. So here we were finding all these interesting player interactions, yet one of the criticisms of race is that it's multiplayer solitaire. To some extent, this is a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you play the game very heads down, if you never look at what's going on in the other player's tableau, if you never make any predictions about what they're going to call, it will feel like multiplayer solitaire. There's no forced interaction. But strategy games work when all players do their best to try to win, and the people who do pay attention generally do a lot better in race. In addition to simultaneous action selection, race also uses simultaneous play, which can really speed up a multiplayer game. So race plays maybe 5 minutes longer when it's a 4-player game as opposed to a 2-player game. When you introduce simultaneous play, that has a bunch of issues around it. First off, there will be times when you have to serialize play in order, because you have some situation where if someone does something, then the game may end and the other person needs that information because they may do something that could end the game, and you have to resolve that timing issue somehow. But as a philosophy, you want to slow down play only when you need to and keep it going. So 2 things that help you do that is, one is to hide non-essential information. So in race, the discards are face down that you use to pay for cards so that people can't go, well, I don't want to decide what I'm doing till I see what you're discarding. I just hide that information. Similarly, you want to minimize your number of synchronization points. If a race has 1 main synchronization point, which is during the action selection and revelation, then players who want to can go ahead with their turns while you might still be exploring, and that's perfectly fine. If you introduce too many synchronization points, you will not get benefit from simultaneous play. Turning to the actual design of cards, I knew I wanted multiple powers on cards. So here we have this terraforming robot, and here in the settle phase, it gets a card on settle, and here there's a consume power as well. And so this card could work with either a produce-consume strategy or an empire-building strategy. And I knew I wanted these multi-power cards in order to get the variety of strategy that I wanted to pack into the game. However, putting multiple powers that fire at different times is tough. It really increases the cognitive load of the game. And you want to make that decision carefully. A lot of some people refer to race not having a learning curve, but a learning spike that the players get impaled on. And a lot of that cognitive load that's blamed on the icons is actually due to the multiple powers. This did influence the card graphics. We added these little swooshes behind things so that players could easily look across the cards in their empire and see the powers. Another issue when you start thinking about designing a game, a card game, is, well, what type of powers do you want to put in the game? Do you want big effects where the game is mostly about assembling a combo of cards? Or do you want smaller incremental powers where it's mostly about gaining an edge and slowly getting more powerful than your opponent? And this is a spectrum. Your game could fall anywhere between these things. At the gain and edge thing, sort of the meta strategy is making lots of small decisions well in order to gradually produce a win. In the combo thing, often the meta strategy becomes stave off defeat until your combo arrives in your hand and then play it and just take out your opponent. So for example, in Hearthstone, you often see someone defending themselves. They have some defender in front of them with high defense. And then when their combo arrives, it's like double their defense, make the attack equal to their defense, wham, take out their opponent. Right? And that's an example of a big combo. I tend to like to make games with lots of tough decisions with good strategic tension, so I'm more on this end of the spectrum here. But it is a spectrum. There's nothing about card sifting or anything that I've talked about so far that says it has to be gain and edge. Right? Glory to Rome is an example of a game that uses big combos, that lets people use the discard pile to assemble their combos, and is notorious for teetering on the edge of control before suddenly someone puts in a combo and wins the game. But I wanted to go with this smaller, simpler powers, and one of my other reasons for doing it was reduce the cognitive load. As I'm sure the people here who haven't played Race before have already noticed, there's a fair amount that's going on in the game. And so the powers in Race are very simple. They're like see an extra card and explore, or get a little extra military, or get a card in the middle of the various phases, or add a new consume power. They're all very small and incremental. There are only 3 powers that really break the rules. One of them is paying for military worlds in order to connect up the military game and the non-military game. I felt that connection was important. Another is to break that rule after having carefully built consume trade as a bonus, is to have some powers that break that rule. And the third is normally you can only make victory points through your empire. But there are some powers that let you spend cards directly for victory point chips, and that breaks that rule. Those 3 I felt were important enough to put in the game, but all the rest I went with very simple powers. So with simple powers, you have the choice of, do you put text on the cards or do you just have icons? And we went with having a mixture. Here we have powers, no text on this card. Here we have some powers with no text that are pretty simple. And then we highlight this phase and we have text right here for the more complex power. Something we didn't expect was that if you have some powers without text, a lot of players then assume all the powers don't have text, even when there's text right there on the card. And so that was a bit of a learning experience. Our model with the textless powers was to keep them, similar to road signs, just a couple basic shapes and a number. This is normally a big mistake. Okay? Normally you want to do everything you can in a game to make it accessible. Because if people won't play your game, then, who cares about the replay value? But with Race, we had noted during playtesting that we had people playing the game hundreds of times, even thousands of times before publication. And so we backed off a little bit on the accessibility to emphasize the ease of road play. Most players who can handle the graphics, I mean, there's some people that it's just not the way their brain works, but the people who can handle the graphics, they find that the game clicks after a couple plays, and then it allows them to play much faster and easier. For the spin-off games, these are geared to more casual audiences, and there we put both complicated icons and the text right there. Similarly here, this is from New Frontiers. And then for Jump Drive, which has very simple powers, we just put a few helper words in the middle of a power. The icons paid dividends when Race was ported to a device, because you can actually see it pretty well on your phone. And then the implementer added an expanded mode, and you can do some actions in this expanded mode, and everything gets text, even the icons that in the base game didn't have text in the mobile app. The card design evolved through many iterations. So here is one of the original prototype cards. This is the finished card. This is all the same card on this slide. These two are Weiwa's designs before he and I started working together. And these last two over here are after the art team gets involved, and we're now testing their ideas on our players. So you can see how it changed quite a bit. So who's who on the Race team? Weiwa Huang, who I've mentioned several times, he did the prototype icons, the card design, some development assistance, and he was the lead designer on Roll for the Galaxy. Jay Tummelson is the publisher, the head of Rio Grande Games, and he's a huge science fiction fan. And in 2007, the German publishers were all convinced that science fiction games would never sell. And so he supported doing it and paid for a lot of artwork from these three gentlemen. He found the art team. And Klaus and Martin do the covers, the card art, some of the 3D modeling that we use, and the logos. And Mirko Suzuki, our skateboard and graphic artist, he does the rules layout, works on the card templates, did all the icons, redoing all the icons, and does all the production work. We've been working together for 13 years now, which is a long time in any field. And we work in a very collegiate way. For Roll for the Galaxy, we talked to the art team and said, you know, how we wanted to position it as the dice version of Race for the Galaxy. And they came back with this idea of floating dice in space with the race symbols coming out in red light, which would help, in yellow light, which would help pick up the difference in the branding. So, you know, they suggest ideas. All the cards are actually designed from a thematic point of view, but I don't tell the artist about it. Okay, so here we have Distant World, and my model for this world, my internal model when I designed this card was Iceland. Iceland has a very isolated population. They are the focus of numerous genetic studies going on in Iceland right now. So that's why it produces a genes good. And Iceland has one of the highest book readership, book ownership rates, cultural interest rates in the entire world. And that's why they have this huge bonus for novelty goods. Do I expect any player to look at this card and go, oh, this is obviously a science fiction analog to Iceland? No. Did I explain this to the artist? No. All I give the artist is the title, and I let them do what they want to. Occasionally, they'll ask me a question or two, but mostly I do this so that they feel fresh and they bring their own ideas to the project. Race does have two thematic inspirations, both of which I credit in the rules. Fred Pohl's Heechee saga contributed the idea of a long-vanished alien civilization where the aliens, all we see are their artifacts. And then David Brin has the idea of Uplift, where alien races are being brought to sentience by other alien races. I use nothing directly from these things, but they were inspirations. Two ideas from optimization theory informed my card design. To make a game more strategic, you want to mind the gap, okay? So here I have New Sparta. They want to put down this military world here. And they have this card, which gives them temporary military, one-shot military. It's cheap, but then they lose a tempo. Or they have this one, which is, I can do this, overkill. It's more expensive than they want. What they actually want is they would like to draw this card here, but they have to make a decision when they're faced in this situation as to whether they want to go into military as a serious strategy or as a one-shot, get this world down, get going. And if you provide all power cost combinations in your game, then it's possible for very tactical play, worrying just about what you need to do right away to dominate. If you start putting in gaps, you force your players to make strategic choices. Random draws reduce this issue for card games because you may not draw the needed intermediate card when you want to use it. But CCGs, drafting, and board games need to be very careful in this area if you want to produce a strategic game. The other idea from optimization is the notion of switching costs and how to overcome them. You don't want your players feeling trapped by their initial hands. So this is a very abstract diagram where these are the strategy hills. And you can think of them as your players trying to climb the hill up to the top. And so this might be symbolize the alien hill with the Alien Tech Institute I've shown you a couple times. And this might be big military. And this might be the novelty strategy. And if your cards initially say, go the alien strategy, and then you don't draw any more of those cards, and your cards now say, go military, you have a switching cost. If you put down the 6 for this military, it will score less because you have fewer of the military cards in your tableau. So you need to come up with some way to compensate players for when they have to switch strategies in the middle of a card game. And the approach I used is the 6 cost devs having both powers and victory point bonuses really helped. In terms of their cost, they are undercosted when you consider both of these items. But when you consider just their powers, I mean, we just saw that a development that gives you 2 military is about 2 cost, right? They're way overcosted. And this provides you a way of putting in compensation without putting in cards that are too powerful in terms of their in-game effects. Finally, another consideration when designing cards is that you want cards to appeal to various player types. Mark Rosewater has a classic article describing Magic player types, and so when it came time to actually design cards, I bore that in mind, and I put in cards that were very efficient for the spike players who really value efficiency and winning on a high percentage basis. Pilgrimage World, which lets you win in a very creative way. It lets you take all those goods, if you had no other consume power, and suddenly consume them in one big swoop. And that appeals to the Johnny's type player who likes to win in very creative ways. And then Timmy, big military, provides the big effects that the stereotypical Timmy player likes. So that's something to bear in mind. So what didn't work? The deck size, which was fine in the base game, became a problem when we got to about beyond 180 cards as we added expansions. This is what statisticians call the sample variance problem. The deck variance remained the same, but the sample, those 30 to 50 cards that a player saw, started to vary too much. And this led us to break the expansions into separate arcs so that you play the base game and you play with these 3 expansions, that's fine, and then you get rid of them, play the base game with some other expansion. That also lets me tell different stories, which as a designer I like. A few cards were a little bit too specialized, and we turned out to have colorblind issues in our browns and our greens. And in Jump Drive, we introduced these dots to try to solve the issue. We actually had a playtester who is extremely colorblind, But the problem was he was an expert bridge player. He just memorized the cards. So we didn't realize that we had a problem. Right? We said, well, if Larry can play it, what's the big deal here? So second edition Race is coming out. It's at the printer right now. And we are adding these dots into the blue, green, and brown worlds to help with the color blind. It's not a complete solution, but it's like a 90% solution, and that's one of the things we're doing. And as long as we were in the game, I made the rules completely gender neutral. They were mostly gender neutral because that tends to be the way I write, but there were 2 he or she's and 12 hises that are now they and their. We added new samples of rounds of play for new players. We added the 6 promo worlds from the app that were designed for the app and added them along with optional start world choice. And then we adjusted 5 cards that were a little too weak, and we will make them available as separate promos through the BGG store. So, some takeaways. I'm not going to read this in detail, but these are things to consider when you're designing a strategy card game. And good luck. So we have about 10 minutes. Questions are welcome. And remember to fill out your evaluations.
Can I ask? Hey, Tom. So I really like what you were talking about multiple different winning strategies. One of the things I really like about Magic is that it has that built into the deck building. One of the things I really don't like, though, is the inevitability with certain strategies where you realize that there's no way you can win against that strategy because your deck isn't set up to do it. So I'm interested to know kind of how you approach balancing different strategies for winning the game.
Okay, so the question is how to balance certain strategies, particularly if one strategy starts to feel inevitable.
Yep.
So part of that is Magic to some extent, particularly at high levels when you're using lots of rares and so on, is a game of big effects and combos. Mm-hmm. By making it a game of smaller effects, the gain the edge thing, you get rid of a lot of that issue. You don't completely solve it. And in 2-player experience in Race, in certain conditions, you can see a very strong develop strategy that can sometimes produce problems. The other thing is it really depends on the length of your game. If you can whip through Race in 10 minutes, the problem's really not a huge problem.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Hi, Tom. So I'm curious, since one of your major contributions to San Juan was the cost crunch coming down, and that remained in place, I believe, to some extent for Race. I'm curious about what led you to that decision and how we can sort of approach holistically to avoid that problem when we're starting from scratch.
So the question is, how did I come up with the cost structure in San Juan?
What led you to realize that it needed to be crunched? Yeah.
Well, one of the problems is simply physical, right? If the cost goes from 1 to 10 and you have to pay 9 cards or 10 cards put down a 10, that's a big hand. Right. And if you want to save some cards in addition, now you're talking about 15 card hands, right? And so part of it was driven by ergonomics. Part of it is driven by the entire deck size. If all players can have 15 cards in hand and cards in the tableau, then we needed more than 110 cards. So a lot of it was driven by external factors.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, my name is Steven. I really enjoy Roll, and I also quite like Race, but Roll has an aesthetic of accessibility that's much easier. The way that the tiles line up in different phases.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's something that I feel that's really important to get people into the game, whether new or old player. I've played Race over and over, and I still can't quite wrap my head around each phase. It's really annoying. So this is, I don't know, is there something that you might want to, I don't want to say fix, but like because they're intrinsically very different games, roll and race. But the way the design and the presentation work makes roll much friendlier to read.
Right. So the question is, why is roll easier to read compared to race? And is there anything we could do to make race easier?
Yeah.
And largely, roll avoids multi-phase powers. In the few tiles that have it, it's the same power that happens to occur twice. And that means that you can have the text right there because it applies to all of the powers on the tile. And the vast majority of the tiles in roll only have one power or one power that happens twice. That makes it a lot easier. It's the multi-phase powers, I suspect, that are causing you, I mean, everyone's different, but I suspect that's what's causing it to make race harder to wrap your head around. And I think it's just the nature of the game. We are committed to the spin-offs in part because we recognize that there's a variety of audiences. And so race, we're sticking with the multi-phase powers, but New Frontiers and roll largely avoid them. Same with Jump Drive.
Okay, thank you.
I'm interested in the balancing of all of the cards that you used in race, and because obviously you are drawing cards and then spending them as a currency, how did you come up with the numbers of 1 cost, 2 cost, 6 cost cards in a kind of balancing way that made sense? Because every time you'd play test it, people could get rid of the different cards each time, things like that.
It is tricky, but part of it was the mind the gap thing. You'll notice there's very few 5-cost developments because I wanted there to be a big step up the sits, and that would be a strategic move. Some of it was identifying what my strategies were. Sorry, I didn't repeat the question. The question is, how did I balance all those cards? Is that fair?
Yeah.
By defining some strategies early on, like the novelty strategy, lots of cheap blue worlds, then that gave me the anchor points that then the other things could be interpolated to within. Okay. I also tried to put in cards that were entire strategies in a card so that you would reevaluate when you drew a card and go, oh, I have consumer markets, maybe I should go the novelty path. So, and then that was cost 5 because cost 5 is really tricky because for just one more you could have a sits dev, right? But so I made those very powerful. So I had a sense of where in the cost spectrum various things would fit. And once I developed my overall strategies, then it was just a matter of interpolating and then testing and revising.
So, with the 6s, which seem like these really strong cards, like how did you come up with the total number? If the 30 to 50 are being drawn, did you always want someone to get at least 1 or 2 or 3? Like some of the, just a little bit more on that sort of balancing how.
Are you asking about the points on them, or are you asking about the proportion of them in the deck?
Well, as a strategy led you to what card you wanted to design, but the feeling for a player as to when I draw that, how often that happened to them and at which stages.
Right. So some of, how did I design the 6s so that, and what led me to decide some of them would be a strategy in a box and some wouldn't. If the strategies were well defined in other cards, then the 6 could be a capstone and mostly just scoring. Okay. If the strategies weren't so well defined in the sits, then its powers needed to be stronger and its VEEPs needed to come down. So for example, the galactic economy in Rebel versus Imperium expansion works with all different colors, and so that's a very powerful power. And we had to reduce the cost of the VP bonus to compensate for that.
So it wasn't OP, basically.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
I also have a question about optimizing and specifically balancing the cards. When you're starting out, before you go through dozens and dozens of initial play tests, how do you prefer to visualize all of the cards in the deck and how they play into each strategy?
Right. So how do I visualize the cards? How do I visualize the strategies before I start playtesting when I'm constructing the initial prototype? Well, every designer is different. In my case, I sit in a tea shop and I write down potential names of cards. That's how I start, okay? And I sort of start grouping them into categories. And I get those names, and I'm just working with the names first, and then I distribute them among costs and so on from that. But I start looking and go, this is one strategy, this is another strategy. And I start circling strategies. This is all before I've assigned numbers to the cards. But by identifying strategies, then it's a lot easier to identify, and then I start thinking about, well, what are the components of this strategy? For example, novelty will be cheap worlds. Alien will be density, because I know I want density as a strategy. And by identifying the key ideas of the strategy, that guides me to putting out some numbers. And in fact, I had all the experience from doing those 3 Puerto Rico card game iterations. Race actually didn't change that much from the first prototype to the actual produced version. So it was 3 weeks in a tea shop. That may not be how other people are going to do it, but that's what it was for me.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, we are now, I believe, at the end of the session, so I'm happy to have questions, but we'll move across the hall to the wrap-up area, all right?
Okay.
All right, thank you.